something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we start.
All right, welcome to Occupy TV. My name is Lauren Regan, and with me is Jamil Jonah. And tonight we're going to talk about the economy and exclusions. And before we dive into the thrust of our conversation tonight, why don't we start off by having me ask you what brought you to the Occupy movement?
I heard about the Occupy movement probably at least 2 or 3 weeks after the initial occupation happened in New York. And what really impressed me about the Occupy movement in New York is that almost, within a pretty short period of time, a lot of major unions joined on to the struggle, and they marched in the streets in huge numbers. I believe it was the Verizon workers, and there was also some air traffic controllers. And, as someone who studies the economy and is very concerned with a lot of the really disturbing trends in terms of inequality, in terms of employment in the United States, I, of course, have been waiting for something like this to happen because, in my opinion, it's long overdue. So I started to look into the local Occupy, and there were a couple of college students here that had started something up. They'd had a couple of GAs. And pretty much I was shocked and very excited after going to the first GA, and they just grew and grew and grew every GA that I went to.
Why don't you explain what you mean by GA for our viewers?
Oh, that's the General Assembly. So these are the big meetings that sort of kicked off the Occupy movement in New York. It was like one of the core aspects of it in terms of democracy. So yeah, I was very inspired, and I became really interested. I also noticed that there was help needed. It seemed like in just organizing. This was a very difficult task to actually organize an occupation site. I think we did extremely well in actually developing the occupation, but it was a lot of work, and I have stayed excited over the course of even the shutdown of the camp up until now. It's certainly a very exciting movement. And how about yourself?
Well, before I answer that question, I guess it makes sense to ask you a little bit about what your background is. So, where were you coming from when you were viewing this new occupation going on?
I came to Eugene a little over 8 years ago, actually, to come and study environmental sociology at the University of Oregon. And after about 4 years into my program, I decided that it was more important for me to actually study economics and political economy in particular. And the reason I decided that was because when I was working in movements, it was obvious to me that when we were developing campaigns, developing rhetoric, developing strategy, there weren't a lot of activists that had a really strong criticism of what was happening in the economy and sort of how the unfairness of the economy was creating a lot of the problems that people were protesting about. So I've been studying at the University of Oregon. I am writing my dissertation on unemployment, and I do a little bit of writing for Monthly Review magazine as well. So again, I was very connected, I guess I would say, to a lot of the issues that have been raised by the Occupy movement.
All right, great. And so, okay, now to answer, right. So my background is that I went to law school here and focused on environmental law, and now run the Civil Liberties Defense Center, which is a local activist nonprofit here in town. And we represent protesters and do Know Your Rights trainings, and I generally travel around the country doing legal defense for mass movements and progressive social change movements. So I'm part of a legal collective that actually got involved once Occupy Wall Street began in New York, and was really happy to find there was a local version of it for me and my organization to plug into. And so I got involved pretty early on in offering up legal resources to this budding movement. We did a bunch of Know Your Rights trainings, and ultimately both you and I ended up becoming liaisons to the city and to the police, helping to organize marches and try to predict when we were going to have encounters with law enforcement and how to minimize the negative effects of that. And now I chair the Legal Research Committee for Occupy Eugene, as well as do trainings all over the state and country for Occupy movements in general.
I could just ask one quick question to follow up. A lot of your previous organizing work, I know you do a lot of legal work for a lot of different movements, but it's been sort of in the environment. And I'm just curious, was there something specific about Occupy, or was there something interesting about working in Occupy in comparison to earlier movements, or was there something that kind of like caught your interest? Or was it just the size of the movement?
Well, I think one of the things that was definitely unique and interesting about it is that because it was such a broad movement, it really kind of encompassed all of the various movements that I had been a part of. So between the environmental movement, the drug policy reform movement, political prisoners and prison reform, as well as really focusing in on class and wealth disparity and capitalism, as the general threat to all of the movements that I'd been a part of. So having kind of a core theme that really united most of the progressive social change movements that I'd been a part of was certainly a powerful appetizer.
Oh.
All right, so part of what we were going to do tonight is talk about your area of expertise, kind of talk about the economy. And part of the reason that I asked you to come and talk about this topic is because I think that activists within the Occupy movement are following a lot of really complex news stories, many of which tie into the economy and these vocabulary words that come out of economic theory and political theory. A lot of us can kind of read the paper and regurgitate some of those words, but we might not necessarily understand the underpinnings or how these things are connected. So I was hoping, you would kind of give us a little bit of an economy 101 for Occupy activists. What are some of the words that we should really come to understand, as well as how the current state of unemployment can be a central theme for campaigns that we're working on, and maybe what the future might hold for those issues. So to get that started, I guess, for me, one of the major buzzwords that we keep hearing as Occupy activists is capitalism, and capitalism as sort of the primary threat to a free country or to democracy. Mm-hmm. And so why don't you start by giving us a brief explanation of what you view capitalism as and why it is sort of this boogeyman that we are all sort of trying to focus around.
Sure. Well, it's not an easy question to answer quickly, but I think it's really appropriate when you're trying to talk about something as large as a social system, which is what capitalism is. It's basically the name that we give to the organization of production and social relations in any particular society. And, the reason why it's important to just say at the outset what it is, or, that's what we're describing, is that out of the debates of the post-war War II in the United States basically developed this idea called modernization or modernization theory. And it was basically like a stage theory of societies, and it kind of like explained or tried to explain what developing countries, what kind of different steps they would need to go through to achieve the pinnacle of a society, which was perceived to be the United States. And what's interesting about the whole debate is that it culminated in this idea that, there's no ideology, there's no other way to organize society. So in other words, there really isn't anything called capitalism. This is just the best of all possible worlds, essentially. It might change to some degree, but there will always be class distinctions, and there will always be sort of for-profit economies, markets. And so the term itself, until the last 3 years, I would say, was really not used often at all. You still hardly ever hear it. But it's really interesting that, as as an idea, generally it's not talked about. People don't want to talk about it. It's history. So, I mean, the way that I would start explaining what capitalism is exactly is by saying that, the root motivation of production and in capitalism in particular, as, say, distinct from feudalism, is that you have a class of people that are termed capitalists that through investment and through their desire to attain wealth, they actually, purchase the means of production, they purchase materials, and they acquire, they hire labor, and they produce goods. And typically when people talk about this, they assume, well, we produce a commodity. Like in the terminology, they'll use the term C, and they'll say we sell that commodity to get money, and then we buy another commodity. So the cycle is C-M for money dash C with a prime, or actually not with a prime, it's just that's the cycle, right? But any critical economist will tell you that's not how capitalism works. It's actually very different. It starts with money, which we use the term capital, and you buy commodities for the purpose of getting more money. So the cycle is actually very different than what you think in in a traditional economy. People don't produce in capitalism. Capitalists do not produce just for use. In other words, they produce for exchange. They produce to create a profit. And what's really interesting about that distinction is that as a system, as an economic system, it must grow. You must have accumulation. And that term accumulation refers to the investment process. And the idea is that unless there's some reason why a capitalist is going to take their money, which they may have saved, invest it into production, and hopefully get a return. The only reason they're going to do that is because if they believe that they will actually get more money back, right? They're not going to invest.
To profit.
Right, they have to profit, right. So they're going to get more in return. So the cycle is M-C-M prime, meaning you get more in the end. And so this is a really crucial component of the whole entire system of capitalism, is that you have a class of people. They tend to have most of the wealth concentrated within that class. They hire labor, they buy materials, and they will only do so, though, and they have the right to withhold their money if they want, if there's likely to be a return on their investments. And so, it's there's a lot of other aspects of capitalism, but as far as how it's related to like the issue of unemployment or the kind of theory that I'm going to talk about a little bit later, that's what I would focus on now. I mean, there's maybe one other really important thing is that it presumes inequality. Like in a capitalist system, you cannot have a steady state. You cannot necessarily have just like one class of people producing. And the reason is that there's power embedded in that whole structure, right? I mean, people are not necessarily going to work unless they're compelled to work for other people. If you ask any person, would you care to work for someone else? Or would you rather work for yourself, or would you rather just farm or do whatever? I mean, most people would not necessarily enter into a contract like that. And incidentally, when capitalism was first forming historically, there was not just a working class ready to work for wages. Most people were farming and they were out in the fields, or they had their own property. And so there was a whole eviction process actually that happened in the history of the system. And usually people point to Great Britain and they talk about how this all happened. Mm-hmm. And it's all really interesting, and I think it's important for people to not just take whatever explanation I've given and just run with that, to actually try to read a little bit about it, because I think it's a really important thing to learn about, because that's the system that we live in.
Well, so what should what are some of the alternatives to capitalism that occupiers might be wanting to research or advocate? What are the solutions to capitalism? Mm-hmm.
Well, I could think of maybe two classes of solutions. One of them would be completely overturning the system and using a completely different type of economic system. And just as an example, like capitalism did not exist prior to, say like the 1700. Prior to that, of course, any indigenous community in the United States, American Indians, for example, or Native Americans, they had gift economies. There's all kinds of different economic formations that have existed in history. So you could look back to those if you wanted to. Within the system, some people talk about the welfare state, which is kind of the idea that, the inequalities that inevitably will exist in capitalism and show themselves can be sort of remedied by the state, and the state will redistribute, for example, money to the unemployed, for welfare's sake. They can also put taxes on capital, et cetera. And that's actually the sort of system that's understood to be in place in a lot of European countries, for example, the ones in crisis right now, especially the Scandinavian countries. They tend to have very high tax rates, and they tend to have much better social support than, say, the United States. However, they do not attract as much investment as the United States, because here you can basically produce any given unit of output cheaper, because, again, labor is cheaper here for very good reasons. Another alternative is, there's a socialist alternative, there's anarchist. These are two historical trends of thought that are opposed to capitalism and have, anarchists, I think, more than socialists have proposed like an actual model for a different society, a very decentralized, stateless sort of society. The details are pretty interesting, but I can say, at least as far as socialism is concerned, which is, I know a little bit more about, the idea is that the economy, one of the ideas that's really in like sharp distinction to what capitalism is, in essence, is that investment and the decisions to produce do not necessarily need to be privatized. They can be centralized, they can be planned. You can have an economy that, doesn't necessarily just produce on whims, because basically the way that production is done in under capitalism, it's like, if I can make profit off something, I'm going to do it. If it causes enormous psychological harm, unless someone's going to catch me, I'm still going to do it because it's highly profitable. Well, in the social system, it would be much more regulated. The economy would be democratized in much the same way that sort of our polity is democratized, like the way that, systems of voting and systems of employment law and things like that, all the institutions, the institutions that we associate with the state. So that's an alternative to actually have a democratized economy where everybody gets a say. The definition of private property in capitalism is that there's no democracy there. There's regulations, but there's they don't have to disclose a lot of things, and you don't even when you have shareholders, they don't necessarily know the inner workings of the system, and no one is privy to that information.
Okay. So almost every day, if you listen to the news or you listen to the radio, we are told by the media what the unemployment figure is for a given day or a week or month or quarter. It's 10%, it's 9.1%. Can you explain when the government is giving us these statistics, when they're telling us what the unemployment rate, what does that rate really mean? What does that term mean, and what is it really actually measuring?
Right. Well, there have been debates about how to measure unemployment for a very long time in the United States, and the biggest debates happened just after the Great Depression, because the economy did get out of the Great Depression, and contrary to what a lot of people think, it wasn't necessarily because of any programs that Roosevelt developed, like the WPA or the CCC. It was actually because of World War II. There was
tell us what WPA and CCC.
Okay, so what the Works Project Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, these were works programs that definitely had a very positive effect, but they did not lift the economy out of crisis.
These were programs that put people back to work that were unemployed at the time.
Yes, they were jobs programs, initiated by the government itself, and it wasn't like what we have now under Obama, where he's basically doling out money to contractors for various projects like road construction and stuff like that. It was very different. So the unemployment rate is, there's a few different concepts that are used to actually come up with the unemployment rate. The first one is something called the civilian labor force. And this is different, and sometimes it's also referred to as the non-institutional civilian population, because of course we do not include prisoners, we do not include any people who, when you ask them, if they say, I don't have a job and I'm not looking for a job, for example, they're not considered part of the labor force. So this is a subjective measure of, okay, what is our sort of denominator? How many people are part of the working population? So once you have that figure, then of course you ask people if you've been out of work. And unfortunately, it's not just that number, am I out of work divided by the civilian institutional population, because you have to be, then to actually be unemployed statistically, you have to also answer that you're looking for work and you have been looking for work within the last, I think it's something like 6 to 8 weeks. So there's all these conditions. The first condition.
Who's asking this question?
This is the U.S. Census Bureau does something called the Current Population Survey, which comes out every single month, and it's based on a pretty large sample of the U.S. cities and also some rural areas.
So if I'm unemployed, the U.S. Census Bureau is calling me once a month and asking me whether I looked for work that month.
Yeah, exactly.
And if I say yes, I'm counted as unemployed. But if I say, screw it, I'm not looking anymore, I'm disgusted, then I am taken out of the unemployment figure?
Yeah, you're not included in the unemployment figure. So what they consider you to be is not part of the labor force because you haven't been looking for work.
So these folks that are have been looking for work for like 6 months, and they maybe have given up at this point, or at some time during that time period they've given up. They are actually considered out of the employment force.
Yes. And so they're not part of the official unemployment rate. And there's actually a couple other classes of workers now that are measured, but also some people consider to be, at the very least, underemployed or subemployed. And I'll explain those two terms. But the idea is that in 1994, but actually it was even prior to that, but 1994 is when the statistics became consistent. They started creating different rates. They called them alternative unemployment rates. And there's actually like 6 of them. And the official one, I think, is the U3 rate, and then there's like the 4, 5, and 6. And the U6 is like the highest. It includes not only people who are quote-unquote discouraged, which is what you were describing, someone who says that I'm looking for work, I would like to have a job, but I haven't looked for work in like, over a month because there doesn't seem to be any jobs. Well, as far as the statistics goes, you're just not part of the unemployment rate. There's also people, though, that are underemployed. They might have a job, but it pay very low, might not cover their rent. And if you ask them, they might say, well, I'd like more work. And those people are not included in the unemployment rate. Then you have people who are fully employed, but aren't making enough to make ends meet as well. So that's a term called subemployment. So if you were to add all these different categories of people up, it almost doubles the unemployment rate. It's much higher than 13 million, which is what people are kind of citing right now.
And in order for you to be counted in any of these figures, it sounds like you have to have a phone. So if you lost your job and you become homeless, you're completely discounted from any of these figures too?
Well, I don't know if you have to have a phone. I think they do actually. I'm pretty sure they go door to door for some of the surveys, but if you don't have a door, if you don't have a home, yeah, definitely. I mean, there's definitely some undercounting, much more undercounting, I would say, than there is overcounting of the employed, of unemployment.
Because it sounds like what you're saying, that the entire unhoused population in this country is not counted as unemployed.
I'm not sure if the Census Bureau does estimates of it, but my guess is that no, I don't think that would be counted. Definitely not. I mean, at the very least, they'd be considered discouraged or not actively looking for work.
So why does the government track this figure in this way? What is the advantage in them being so specific in the humans that they're actually counting as unemployed?
Well, I don't think that it's all conspiratorial. I think that there is a real effort to try to say, because in some cases, if I'm a college student, by the way, there's also an age range here, this is only from 16 to 55, I believe, or 16 to 65 or something like that. Or the upper bound there might not be an upper bound, but it's definitely a certain age range. They are trying to figure out, well, say I'm a college student, and I'm not working, I'm not part of the labor, I'm of age, but I'm not really part of the labor force. Or say I'm a pregnant woman that's not working or something like that. So there's some reasons to restrict that denominator and, and make sure, try to come up with a more comprehensive estimate. So I don't think it's all that. However, I do think that there's really obvious political, implications. Well, first of all, it's an example of the economy failing really badly. And people know it viscerally, right, the people who are unemployed. But as a society, as people, other activists, for example, or middle-class people that may be organizing, we may not know the real extent of this. And if we did, it might outrage people significantly. So I definitely think that there is that rationale, for sure. You don't want to have to admit a very high rate of unemployment.
And it's mostly mainstream economists that use this measure to explain mass unemployment?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, most mainstream economists do not cite the U6 rate. They don't even talk about it. It's just not, it's unimportant to them, I would say. They have a lot of different ways of rationalizing the unemployment rate. Even when the economy is like at full throttle, they actually have a term that they come up with which is called the natural rate of unemployment. You know, this is very interesting because this natural rate of unemployment was, of course, developed statistically and tried to explain that, it has to do with the friction of, when you lose a job and it takes you some time to find a job, and, and then there's people who are just unemployable for whatever reason. And so they try to come up with all these rationale to say, well, there's just this like base level of unemployment that's just always going to be there. The interesting thing about the natural rate of unemployment, though, if you look at it over time, their sort of level of it has increased over time. So like it started pretty low, it's something like 3%, and now it's like at 6% almost. So they say that's the natural rate of unemployment.
Which means no matter how healthy the economy is, we would have 6% of the country unemployed.
Around there, yeah. Whether they consider that to be functioning really well. So, yeah, I mean, I think, just to go into a little bit more of the mainstream explanations, I think they're really interesting to discuss because a lot of people tend to, especially in the United States, because it's a very individualist country, they tend to blame each other, or blame themselves, and also each other for being unemployed. Like, for example, you'll hear a lot in the media, technology is developing at such a fast pace and people need to upgrade their skills, they need to get an education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I would class like those kinds of explanations under like the blame the victim model. Then you might also hear a lot of conservatives blaming the government, and what they say that the government is doing wrong is giving any money or any support at all to unemployed people, because they argue that because people get support, they're not looking for jobs at all, as if it's sufficient to actually support someone just getting unemployment. So they say that they're voluntarily unemployed, and they think that that actually is what's continuing this crisis right now, for example, because the government has supported unemployed people, but only for a certain period of time, and certainly there's lots of people that are left out of that support. The other thing that you'll see happening is blaming outsiders. So a lot of times immigrants will come into play as the cause of unemployment. People will say, if all of this immigration hadn't happened, then we would have a lot less unemployment. The interesting thing about that, I think over Obama's administration, he had the record number of deportations over the last 3 years or 4 years. It was over 1 million, but I think it was 1.3, 1.4 million. So the immigration flow has actually reversed. Yet
and it's interesting because especially in our area, like for instance this fall, the orchards, like up in the Hood River area, actually couldn't find enough workers to pick their fruit, and a lot of it just rotted and they lost money. And part of the reason was that they had normally been hiring a lot of undocumented workers who were literally the only people that would do that job. And they say the same thing for like slaughterhouses and, some of the most grueling, demanding jobs in the country. The producers, the owners say, the only people who will do this work are immigrants. And so...
Well, I think the qualification would be the only people that would do it for the wages that we're willing to pay are immigrants. And you have to realize that, whenever a corporation talks about that, and the same goes for offshoring, for example, which is another thing. We don't blame the immigrants, but we blame the Chinese, for example, for stealing our jobs. In both those situations, they are not willing to pay people, like, in terms of immigrants, for example, people substituting for those jobs, they're not willing to pay any significant wages. People are indentured they're basically indentured servants, which is why their wages can go so low.
All right. Well, so that's all pretty interesting. So given how mainstream economists view mass unemployment, as some kind of natural function of this system, what theory do you use in your research, and how does it differ from the mainstream theories?
The theory that I developed is called the theory of monopoly capitalism, and to try to be as brief as possible, the theory kind of, it's a theory, it's a political economic theory. So what I study is political economy. It's not economics proper. Economics doggedly avoids, like the influence of, they actually assume that there's equal power between workers and capitalists. So like, they can bargain almost somehow an equal power for their wages, as if there's not this huge pool of unemployed people that can, that was willing to come in and take your job if you're not going to accept whatever wage rate that they want to give you. So the theory basically starts off with a historical analysis of the U.S. economy, which focuses on around the turn of the 20th century when major mergers happened in the United States, and this was like the initial consolidation of corporate power, and it was the early sort of multi-divisional corporations that eventually became the giant transnational corporations of today. And the theory basically argued that, as this happened, as these large corporations, started to dwarf the small producers that existed in the U.S. economy prior to that, and started to swallow them up, the whole nature of competition changed. The whole sort of way that the economy functioned changed in some pretty crucial ways. But the most significant were, first of all, that simple competition, the way that we understand it, doesn't really exist anymore. Like price competition. The corporations do compete, but they can compete in very different ways. They compete, by marketing, by obsolescence, by all of these different means that essentially increase the cost to consumers, and at the same time keep their prices pretty high. They're able to keep their prices high in that way. The other dynamic that came into play is that the whole process of like the work process, the labor process, really became scientifically managed and scientifically dialed in, to the point where if you actually like analyze the factories in China and actually see how people are doing their work, I think there was an article I read about people twitching in bed from the repetitive motions that they had to go through every day. I mean, these work processes are designed in such a way to fully extract all of your labor power, your energy, and as a result to extract all the value out of any process that you're participating in. And so the theory basically said that the major corporations essentially are able to accumulate capital on an enormous scale. So much, in fact, they're so good essentially at extracting value, extracting capital, profiting off of the production process, that there becomes a problem of absorbing the surplus. Like, where do you invest it? Remember I said earlier about capitalism, the whole motive force of it is investment. The capitalist has to invest that money somewhere that they're able to extract in the production process. And if they have nowhere to invest it, if it just sits outside the economy, well, that creates crisis. Because then there's no growth. There actually isn't people, there isn't anyone in there to employ. There has to be a certain rate of investment to actually keep the economy functioning. So in the simplest terms, the theory of monopoly capital argues that the rise of the giant corporation created this additional problem of the investment of the surplus, where to invest the surplus. And it was so good at extracting value, and basically what that means is wages, because it actually affects the wages of people when you're able to exploit at a very high rate. You're able to compensate people at a lower amount, but then they don't have the money to invest to buy commodities, and that also is another way that investment is choked off. If you look at graphs of productivity and wages in the United States, basically they go like this: productivity goes like this, and wages goes like this. You'll hear this all the time, that real wages have stagnated, and they mean that the amount that real wages are not just what you get paid, but what you can buy with what you get paid. Because if the price of something goes up, it doesn't matter how much wages you're getting. That's an effect on your wages, right? For basic commodities. So you have productivity going like this, wages going like this. What that means is that if I want to invest more, and I assume that people are going to buy more of my goods, but their wages are going down, and literally they're going into enormous debt, then that's a problem. I'm actually not going to invest, because I'm going to see that people are going into foreclosure.
Right.
People are going into major debt, and they're not able to buy things. So,
well, and a conversation about debt could be an entirely separate show, I think.
Yeah.
So what do you think occupiers should know about the economic crisis?
Well, what I think is really important, I mean, I guess when I talk about some of the economic issues, I know it's difficult to explain in short sound bites and whatnot, but I do think that it's an important thing to have some kind of analysis of what's happening. And my main reason for that is that, there's a natural tendency to pick up the kind of rationales that exist in the media and to then just repeat them. An example would be, I was at a protest and people were talking about, they were protesting Buy Nothing Day and talking about, they were chanting something about all the products in Walmart being from China and, kind of like insinuating that it was that was the problem, right? It was the offshoring to China. And I think that it's really bad for the Chinese, not just for us if you think it's bad for us, but of course it's bad for the Chinese if you look at the conditions under which people are working. So I think it's first of all, it's very helpful for us to be able to develop messages that actually resonate with people and that also bring solidarity. Because I don't think that putting the blame on the Chinese, for example, is really going to do anything. We could try to blame the corporations and say, you should bring your production back to the United States. But actually, corporations are obliged legally to make profit. And if they're going to make more profit by going overseas, that's what they're going to do. And if the government tries to legislate that corporations, come and stay here in production, it's not going to work. It's going to create another crisis, and it's not going to happen politically either because economic power is so concentrated in monopolies. So you have to. I think it's important to try to understand some of these dynamics. Number one, so you can resist some of the things that you hear in the media, and then also help you develop some like a coherent message and have a common analysis as well. Like in that context, what is the thing to do? Should we try to kick out immigrants? Should we try to get the corporations to come back from China? Mm-hmm. Well, no, not necessarily at all. There's other things. There's specific things that I might argue for personally, but I think what I would want to engender is more of a conversation and discussion and study of these problems, because I think that they're so deep-seated that, at least in my own opinion, it's going to have to be some pretty radical change.
Well, so what, if there is a protest at Walmart, what do you see as the appropriate chant? What are the appropriate talking points for dealing with a monstrosity that sucks the life out of everything around it, like Walmart?
I think that the appropriate chant in Walmart would be about Walmart, its exploitation of its workers, including the workers in Walmart itself. Something like, yeah, we have cheap commodities coming in, but that's only cheapening our way of life, right? Mm-hmm. Coming in from China, and we're getting paid nothing working in this store, right? And we're just selling wares that are, produced at highly exploitative wages in other countries. So we should have solidarity with the Chinese, not criticism.
Well, so what do you say to a shopper who is barely making ends meet? They got a bunch of babies or whatever it happens to be, and they're shopping at Walmart because literally it's the cheapest place for them to buy goods. What do we say to that person to attempt to empower them to make better choices, or to educate them about why there is a better choice? Yeah.
Well, I don't know that there is, actually. I don't know that I would go up to a shopper and say, hey, you should shop at the Saturday market, and you should shop at Sundance, and you should shop at Kiva or something like that, or you should buy local. The reason why is because, frankly, the large corporations have pretty much a stranglehold on our economy, and they produce things as cheaply as they can be produced. And I don't know what I would say to that person. What if they don't have the income to purchase those items? They can't buy organic, maybe they can't buy fresh food. I think that's the case for a lot of people.
How do we turn that around, though? Because we hear a lot of times that you should, vote with your dollars, or
I think that's crap.
You should make choices based on, where you spend your money. But then, like you said, we have a lot of people right now in the country that don't have that luxury to be able to make those choices. So what power, can they
I don't
bring?
believe those are solutions. So what I would say is vote with your feet and vote with your brain. I would say talk to each other, learn, become part of the Occupy movement, see what we're all about, come to the educational series that we're going to have. We're going to talk about a lot more of these issues in depth, and just realize, well, I mean, you're saying what would an activist say to someone, or what would we say to those people? Yeah, it's difficult. There's no sound bite, that I could use. But I mean, that's what I'm saying though about the economic analysis. Maybe you wouldn't necessarily target Walmart and just try to do a boycott of Walmart. Maybe if you wanted them to, fix some aspect of their behavior, like their swales that they create for their parking lots for environmental reasons. Maybe you have a campaign about that. I think that's neither here nor there. You might do that. But what I would say is, an analysis, a strong analysis of the economy might actually encourage you to make very different decisions in terms of strategy. And this is the crucial thing that I would bring up. It's these problems that we have in our society are complicated. It's very worth it for us to go through some of these discussions and to say, well, maybe we want to have some goal that we can win, fine. We can have certain campaigns like that. But if we know X and Y and Z are the case as far as the economy goes and as far as the current economic crisis goes, maybe we should focus differently.
Well, so where should we focus? Mm-hmm. If you, on your own, based on your area of expertise, were to look at targets or campaigns that would actually get at some of the heart of the issues that we've been talking about already tonight, what would those campaigns look like?
Well, I mean, my own personal opinion is that, and I think this relates to my experience on the occupation site, which is that in addition to the many biases and sort of problems that we have communicating and working with each other as far as race, gender, ethnicity, in addition to that, there's big class divides in the United States. And these biases are just as pervasive, and they are very intense. And I think at the occupation site, the amazing thing that happened, to me at least, was that in organizing with different groups, the issues themselves may initially not matter that much. Like in the case of Occupy, just occupying public space and being out there and holding those conversations with a group of people that you normally would never even talk to in this town was very substantial. And I think the same thing of particular campaigns. What are the least among us, suffering from right now? What are most people going through really serious issues around right now? I mean, I would say foreclosures would definitely be one thing. Unemployment is a huge thing. Mm-hmm. Anyone, if you say that your message is about, jobs and how we can create them, they're going to agree. They're going to say, well, yeah, I need a job and I would like a better job. Mm-hmm. What's interesting about a good analysis too, or a strong analysis, is it's going to relate to people's experience. Mm-hmm. Not that every important issue is going to, because some people might not really care about the environment. They might be totally disconnected, for example, from the environment. But that still doesn't mean, that you can't eventually fight those issues or fight those issues at the same time, but then have another set of campaigns, like I said, maybe around foreclosure, creating jobs, maybe a jobs program, try to encourage, Oregon to actually employ people. There's tons of work that could be done. There's lots of possibilities. We could use a bullet train, for example, from here to Portland. That seems like a reasonable thing to spend money on. But you can't necessarily expect the private economy to actually help with that because, frankly, it's been failing significantly. And it's not because, despite the rhetoric, it's not necessarily because there's not enough education or the unions have too much power. Unions have been declining for years and years and years. It's the lowest it's been in, I don't know, a long time, at least since the 30s. So, or before the laws around unionization actually came in, were actually passed in the 1930s. So, yeah, it's a difficult question. I think most important, we have to discuss them. We have to have more discussions about it. But again, in the context of an analysis, and this is what I think is really, I do think is really sort of missing. And I also think that when I talk about it, because people may know that I'm critical of capitalism, and they'll kind of put you in a box. Like if someone says they're an anarchist, the same thing will happen. And I think that there's good reason for that, because there is a lot of Cold War mentality that people have not really lived down. They haven't really gotten past. That's still in the sort of the ideology of of our country. There's also the reality that a lot of attempts at different economic systems have failed. Or different societies have failed, or not gone very well at least. And in addition to that, when people look at the economy and they look at economics as a profession, they think it's kind of, they don't believe it. If you look at Inside Job or you look at the financial crisis, people are really disillusioned. They think that, it's very mystical to them because there's really no clear, coherent message about what's happening in the economy at all. But, I mean, I guess in response to that, I would say, there was a real science of economics. I mean, it was not called economics. Again, it was called political economy. And, all these people that we talk about, like Adam Smith, Karl Marx, they really tried to understand, like in a serious way, thoroughly. And they tried to make a science out of this study of the society. And I think that they did a pretty good job. And I think that, there is people carrying that tradition forward. And so before you make assumptions about someone, whatever, based whatever critique they have, I think it's good to, to try to listen and understand what some different perspectives might be.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned a minute ago about some of the value that you experienced from actually occupying public space, occupying the commons. And we're coming up on the spring, the weather's getting nicer again. I guess my first question would be, what did you see as the primary benefits in organizing while occupying public space? And then the second question would be, should we do it again?
Well, I thought that, I guess I think that after doing it once, I think the benefits could be much greater. But the benefits initially of occupying public space were, at least for me as an individual, I can say tremendous. It felt so good to break out a little bit and just see other people and realize how many other people were frustrated and really wanted to do something about that frustration in a creative way. And I think that we also have created a really solid bunch of humans here in town that are really willing to put their time in and energy into not only building, a movement and actually doing actions, but just building a different kind of community. I think we need a really much stronger, more developed political culture where we actually talk about politics and we use terms like capitalism and we actually study them. This is uncommon in other places. People understand what capitalism is in other places really well. It's here where the great benefits of imperialism and capitalism are, frankly used very effectively to propagandize and to convince people that, again, this is the best of all possible worlds, that we don't have those discussions. They're kind of, they're taboo. And I think the being outside and actually protesting in that way, the constancy of it, also the social service aspect of it was very important for this community, I think for any community that it happened in. And I definitely think that we should occupy in the spring for that reason, and also because I think we could do a much more sophisticated and better job.
So what would it look like if you were to have carte blanche to invoke an occupation as you would see fit? What would it look like?
Well, I don't have the master plan on that. I think that would be a fantastic thing to discuss with other people, but I can just say, based on the energy and sort of talent, the sort of skills that I have observed within Eugene and the dedication as well. I think that we should do some of the things the same. I think we should actually have medical services as we've set up weekly now in the park blocks. I think that we should have a kitchen. I think we should develop. One of my major sort of dreams would be to try to develop some kind of capacity for people to produce things. For example, the people who are unhoused to maybe build their own yurts or something like that. And I think that the idea there would be to say, look, we don't just want the dole. We don't just want money from the government. We want something to do. We want to be employed. We want to be able to sustain ourselves. And to me, that message comes through in a program like that, where we actually organize ourselves to such an extent that we produce on our own and are able to make things that we need, because there is things that people need. There is a lot of poverty, frankly, and obviously homelessness, and it's horrible. We should all be really embarrassed, really, as a community and as a society, that so many people are left behind. So, and actually, interestingly, in the 1930s, this happened, where they actually got support from the U.S. government at that time for these local unemployment cooperatives, essentially. Mm-hmm. So I think that would be interesting.
So, I mean, one benefit that I saw from the occupation sites is that we do have this really large homeless population in Eugene, and we really have no facilities or structures set up for them. You know, there's one religious-based shelter that if you pray, you get fed, and you know, it's literally handouts and a cot to sleep on, and men and women are separated, and no animals are allowed there. And so one thing that I saw was that the occupation site, you know, filled a pretty significant need, even with its meager offerings of, you know, just being a legal place to set up a tent in the pouring rain. Many people, either because they had animals or because they couldn't be in the intense housing situation of a shelter, or they didn't want religion as, you know, part of the deal, all sort of gravitated toward this occupation site. And then once they were there, kind of discovered activism, or, you know, discovered comrades that were willing to stand up and advocate for some of their needs as well, with them, not at them, as a value that they had. And so I would say, you know, if we were to have an occupation site in the future, you know, that's part of the model that I think we do need to be able to repeat again, is, you know, we need to find a way to be able to provide for the basic needs of people where the city is no longer doing that. You know, and I think as the economy goes down, you know, the first things that are being gutted from all of these budgets are social services. You know, we're never going to lose money from cops and jails and things like that, but mental health and you know, food kitchens and things like that are going to basically be the first things to go. And so we as a community have to step up and be able to provide those things, and we need to start practicing in doing that. And like you mentioned, you know, the medical tent is a perfect example, a great example of how, you know, within our own community, people who care are stepping up and providing a service that is no longer provided unless you're rich. And, you know, we talked about toward the end of the occupation about trying to get computer labs so that people could work on resumes. You know, we could try to assist people in getting long-term shelter, whether that's VA benefits or SSD or, you know, whatever it might be. And all of those endeavors were cut short by the city and by the Eugene police when they, you know, prematurely evicted everyone from that site and literally tossed people back into the gutter.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say about that most people might not know too is that eviction really started much earlier than when the rhetoric around it, or when the police issued the report arguing that, well, very one-sidedly, that there was all this violence and all these issues going on at the occupation site, that a large percentage of which were dealt with by our peacekeepers, et cetera. But it started much earlier, when, you know, the city didn't want to give us the support that we needed. I mean, we had volunteers ready, especially if the site would have gotten more sophisticated, if we would have had some electricity, if we would have had a little bit better gray water system. I think that we could very easily have developed a pretty sophisticated outdoor site that could have lasted right through the winter. And it's not only that, you know, people were kicked back into the gutters, their little community that they had started to create was destroyed as well, which it had already started to form. You know, people signed agreements very much like they sign when they go to one of the warming centers, for example. And that was all developed right there on the site amongst the people that were living at the site. And so
signed agreements saying no violence, no drugs and alcohol.
Exactly. A lot of the things that, you know, people were arguing were the problem, that's what they had agreed to sort of ban from the site. And so, you know, the city, it was a protest. But our protest was very explicitly, I think, along the lines of what you were suggesting. It was attempting to really comprehensively, you know, provide in a way, but not just provide resources, also to encourage people to be part of a movement. And that's, I think, what was really exciting to a lot of people. And ultimately, that's the kind of person that stayed and was actually at that site.
Well, so on that note, since we only have a few minutes left in this show, in terms of empowering a movement, We are starting an organizer training series next week, and who knows when this show will air, but there's a program going on at Occupy 5 called Occupation Education, which is basically meant to take people who want to become community organizers and give them the skills to up their game, basically. And I think that one of the gifts that this community has gotten, regardless of whether people agree or disagree with occupying public space, or whether they disagree or agree with some of the protests or tactics that the movement has taken, is, in the aftermath of this movement, whatever may happen, there's going to be a ton of new activists in this town.
Right.
People who, never held a picket sign in their life until now. And oftentimes, they became activists almost by no choice of their own. We had people who would show up at the Occupy site with a tent that said that their home had just gotten foreclosed, and they'd never been involved in activism at all. And this series, that's going to be like 10 or 15 weeks long, is basically meant to take some of those folks and give them the skills to plan protests and to give us as a movement the skills to be more strategic in our campaigns and in our protests.
In addition to that, too, just being part of the Occupy community, which there is one that exists, and it's pretty amazing. And I think that, whether you see yourself as an organizer or wanting to be an organizer, at the very least, an active community member, which we're not, frankly, the vast majority of us in this town. And I include a lot of people on the campus, unfortunately. So yeah, even if people are just interested in learning more about Occupy, or really trying to experience, I think, some of the really special and important changes that have happened within this community, I think they'd really benefit from this series.
So if people want to get more information about this training series or about Occupy Eugene in general,
they're just going to go to occupyeugenemedia.org. That's our website. It's occupyeugenemedia.org, and the Occupation Education series will be /occupation-education. So occupyeugenemedia.org and /occupation-education.
And the series is every Wednesday night from 6:30 to 8:30 at Occupy 5, which is 7th and Polk. The series is free and open to anyone who wants to come. You don't have to come to all the sessions, though we strongly encourage people to try to come to as many as possible. And we're going to have fantastic trainers from a wide variety of movements coming to share their expertise with us in the hopes of making us stronger and more effective come this spring.
Right. Yeah, and it's a reflection of the coalitions and a lot of the involvement that Occupy encouraged among local nonprofits and local groups, and that's really the expression of that is going to be their participation in this education series.
So we encourage everyone to come and get involved with Occupy Eugene. And with that, my name is Lauren Regan, and thank you very much for joining us for Occupy TV, and we hope to see you down at the Occupy site very soon. Thank you.
Something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's